What if the people who built the pyramids were genetically different from the Egyptians we imagine today? And what if, after thousands of years, their DNA has finally started to tell us who they really were? For centuries, we have looked at the pyramids, the temples, the statues, and the painted faces of ancient Egypt and thought we understood the people behind them. But now, ancient DNA is opening a door that history could never fully close. If you want to see what is really hiding behind the image of ancient Egypt, stay with me, because the first clue comes from a man who lived almost 5,000 years ago. Imagine standing beside the Nile thousands of years ago. There are no modern cities, no highways, no airplanes crossing the sky, only the river, the desert, farms, villages, boats, and enormous stone monuments rising into the distance. This is the Egypt we know from history, the land of pharaohs, the land of pyramids, the land of mummies and golden masks, a civilization that seemed almost impossible for its time. And yet, behind all of those monuments were ordinary human beings, farmers, builders, priests, soldiers, mothers, fathers, children. People who laughed, worried, worked, loved, became sick, grew old, and eventually died. We know many things about their world. We know what gods they worshipped. We know how they buried their dead. We know what foods they ate. We know some of their rulers. We can even read some of their words. But there was one question that remained frustratingly difficult. Who were these people, genetically? Where did their ancestors come from? How, after much, did ancient Egyptians change over thousands of years? And perhaps, most importantly, were the people of ancient Egypt genetically similar to the Egyptians living along the Nile today? For a long time, scientists had only pieces of the puzzle. Modern DNA could tell us about people living today. Bones could tell us about ancient bodies. Paintings could show us how Egyptians represented themselves. But DNA from ancient Egyptian remains was extremely difficult to recover. Heat destroys DNA. Time destroys DNA. And Egypt is one of the hottest places where archaeologists have tried to recover genetic material from ancient human remains. Mummification also created problems. For decades, researchers tried to unlock the genetic secrets inside Egyptian mummies with mixed results. Then, something changed. Scientists began developing better methods for finding tiny fragments of ancient DNA. And in 2017, researchers studying mummies from a site called Abusir el Malek recovered mitochondrial DNA and genome-wide data from ancient Egyptians who lived roughly between the late New Kingdom and the Roman period. And the results were surprising. The ancient Egyptians from this particular community showed strong genetic connections with populations from North Africa and the Near East. And that was only the beginning. Because in 2025, researchers announced something even more important. They had obtained the first full genome sequence from an ancient Egyptian individual, one man, one body, one genetic record that had survived for roughly 4,500 to 4,800 years. His remains came from Nuweirat in Middle Egypt, near Beni Hassan. He lived during the early Dynastic or Old Kingdom period, around the time Egypt was becoming the great civilization we recognize from the pyramids. And his DNA gave scientists something they had never possessed before, a much clearer genetic window into early Egypt. But before we look at what the DNA revealed, we need to understand something important. Ancient Egypt was never a single frozen population. Egypt existed for thousands of years. Think about that. The civilization lasted longer than the time separating us from many civilizations we consider ancient. Kingdoms rose, dynasties ended, foreign. The armies arrived, trade routes changed, people moved, families married outsiders, new rulers took power, old traditions survived, others disappeared. So asking, what did ancient Egyptians look like genetically, is a little like asking, what did Europeans look like genetically? There is no single answer. A person living in Egypt 4,500 years ago was not necessarily genetically identical to someone living there 2,500 years later. And someone living in southern Egypt could have had a different ancestry from someone living in the northern Nile Delta. That difference matters, because one of the biggest mistakes we can make is turning ancient Egypt into a single photograph. It was not a photograph. It was a moving story. And DNA is finally allowing us to watch parts of that story. The man from Nuweirat is especially important because he lived incredibly early in Egyptian history. Radiocarbon dating places him around 2855 to 2570 BCE. That means he lived during a period connected to the early Dynastic and Old Kingdom worlds. This was not a man from the Roman period. He was not living after Alexander the Great. He was not living under Roman rule. He belonged to a much earlier Egypt. And his genome revealed something fascinating. Most of his ancestry was best represented by ancient North African populations. But approximately 1/5 of his genetic ancestry was connected to populations from the eastern Fertile Crescent, including ancient groups associated with Mesopotamia and surrounding regions. Think about what that means. Long before modern borders existed, people were already moving. Ideas were moving, animals were moving, plants were moving, technology was moving, and apparently people were moving too. This is where the story becomes much bigger than Egypt. Because ancient Egypt did not develop inside a sealed box. The Nile Valley was connected to the wider world. To the south was Nubia and the rest of the Nile corridor. To the northeast were the Sinai and Levant. Beyond them lay the eastern Mediterranean and Mesopotamia. To the west stretched North Africa. The Mediterranean Sea offered another highway. The Red Sea opened another route. People could travel across these regions through trade, migration, marriage, conflict, and many other forms of contact. For a modern person, a movement of people across hundreds of miles can seem enormous. For ancient populations, however, these movements could happen generation after generation. One traveler arrived, then another. A merchant settled, a family moved, a soldier stayed after a campaign, a marriage connected two communities. And slowly, over centuries, DNA changed. That may be one of the most important lessons from the Egyptian genome. Ancient civilizations were connected much earlier than we sometimes imagine. But there is another question. If this early Egyptian man had mostly North African ancestry with a significant connection to the eastern Fertile Crescent, what does that say about modern Egyptians? This is where the answer becomes more complicated. Modern Egyptians carry ancestry from many periods of history. Some of it connects to ancient populations in North Africa. Some is related to populations from the eastern Mediterranean and West Asia. There are also genetic contributions from populations farther south in Africa. The exact mixture varies from person to person and from region to region. And that makes perfect sense when we remember Egypt's history. The country was invaded, it traded, it absorbed migrants, it ruled other lands, it was ruled by foreigners. Greeks arrived, Romans arrived, people from the Levant arrived, people from other parts of Africa moved through the Nile Valley. Arab migrations and later historical movements also changed the population. Egypt was never isolated. But here is where many popular stories about ancient Egypt begin to break apart. Some people imagine ancient Egyptians as completely identical to modern Egyptians. Others imagine them as completely different. Both ideas are too simple. The truth is more interesting. There was continuity, but there was also movement. There was ancestry that stayed, and there was ancestry that arrived. There were families that remained in the Nile Valley for countless generations, and there were newcomers who became part of Egyptian society. That is how human populations usually work, and they change without completely disappearing. If you're enjoying this journey into the DNA behind ancient, is where Egypt, take a moment to think about one question. When you hear the words ancient Egyptian, what kind of person do you picture? Keep that image in your mind because the genetic evidence is about to make that picture much harder to keep simple. For a long time, scholars had to rely on clues. Outside DNA, they studied skulls, they studied skeletons, they studied art, they studied language. They compared ancient Egyptians with neighboring populations. Each method revealed something, but each method also had limits. A painting is not a DNA test. A statue is not a family tree. And the shape of a skull cannot tell you every place your ancestors came from. Ancient DNA is different. It can reveal biological relationships that cannot be seen with the naked eye. But even DNA has limits, and this is something the internet often forgets. One ancient genome cannot speak for an entire civilization. The Nubia individual was one man, one place, one moment in time. He does not represent every Egyptian who ever lived. That is why the scientists behind the 2025 study were careful. They stressed that more ancient genomes are needed. And this is extremely important. Imagine finding one person from a modern city and using that person to describe everyone in the country. You would immediately know that was not enough. Ancient Egypt deserves the same caution. The evidence is powerful, but it is still incomplete. There are thousands of years and enormous parts of the population that remain poorly sampled. We need more DNA from northern Egypt, more from southern Egypt, more from different periods, more from women and men, more from different social classes, more from people outside major burial centers, and especially more DNA from ancient Nubia and Sudan, because the Nile did not stop at Egypt's southern border. The river connected communities across northeastern Africa. And that brings us to another important problem. For decades, debates about ancient Egyptian identity were often forced into modern categories. People wanted a simple answer. Were ancient Egyptians African? Were they Middle Eastern? Were they something else? But ancient people did not live according to modern racial categories. The ancient Egyptian world existed thousands of years before modern ideas about race developed in their current forms. Geography itself was different. Population borders were different. And identity was often connected to language, culture, religion, political loyalty, and local community. A person could be culturally Egyptian while having ancestors from somewhere else. A family could move into Egypt and become Egyptian over generations. A person could have ancestry from multiple regions. While identifying with one society, this is not unusual. It is normal human history. And DNA is showing us just how messy that history can be. Consider the Nile itself. The river runs through one of the world's harshest environments. Without it, large parts of Egypt would be desert. But because of it, communities could survive. Crops could grow, cities could develop, trade could expand, and people could move. The Nile was not simply a source of water. It was a giant human corridor. For thousands of years, it helped connect people from different parts of Africa. At the same time, Egypt faced toward the Mediterranean and the Near East. That gave the country a unique position. It was African. It was connected to the Mediterranean. It was connected to West Asia. It was a meeting place. And perhaps that is exactly why its genetic history looks so complex. Now think about the pyramids. When people see the Great Pyramid, they often focus on the impossible scale of the structure. Millions of stone blocks, precise planning, huge labor forces, a civilization capable of organizing thousands of people. But the DNA story reminds us of something we often forget. The people who created these monuments were not mythical beings. They were human. They came from families. They had ancestors. Their ancestors had ancestors. And those ancestors had already been moving across the ancient world for generations. The pyramid builders were part of a human story much larger than Egypt. They did not suddenly appear beside the Nile. They were the result of thousands of years of population history. And that leads to another mystery. If the early Egyptian genome shows both deep North African ancestry and a significant connection to the eastern Fertile Crescent, when did those connections begin? Was there one major migration? Or did small movements happen over thousands of years? Did traders bring people into Egypt? Did communities move slowly through the Levant? Did migration happen through the Sinai? Could some movement have traveled by sea? Researchers cannot yet answer every part of this question. But the evidence points toward long-term contact. Archaeology had already shown connections between Egypt and the eastern Fertile Crescent. Egyptians exchanged goods. They adopted technologies. They interacted with distant communities. The DNA now suggests that cultural exchange was not the whole story. Some people themselves moved. And that is a powerful shift. Because objects can travel without people. A tool can be traded. A plant can be carried. A writing idea can spread. But DNA tells us that at least some human movement was happening too. Somebody had to make that journey. Somebody left one community and entered another. Somebody became part of a new family. And their descendants may still carry traces of that movement today. That is the emotional side of ancient DNA. It turns history from a list of kings into a story about people. A man buried thousands of years ago can suddenly become more than a skeleton. He becomes evidence of a journey, a reminder that people have always crossed boundaries, always searched for better places, always followed rivers, always traded, always married, always adapted. And sometimes they became part of a civilization that future generations would call ancient. But there is an even more surprising part of the story. The DNA from later ancient Egyptians also suggests that Egypt's population changed over time. The 2017 study examined remains from Abu Sir el-Malek, a community in Middle Egypt with burials spanning many centuries. Researchers found that these ancient individuals had strong genetic connections to populations in the Near East and Levant. They also found evidence that the proportion of ancestry related to populations south of the Sahara was higher in modern Egyptians than in those ancient samples. That does not mean ancient Egyptians had no ancestry from other parts of Africa. They absolutely lived in a region where people from different parts of Africa interacted. Historical evidence shows intense contact between Egypt and Nubia. Trade, warfare, migration, political control, and marriage all connected these populations. The problem is that ancient DNA sampling from southern Egypt and Sudan remains limited, so scientists cannot yet describe the full story. And this is where responsible science matters. It is tempting to take one result and turn it into a giant claim, but ancient DNA does not work that way. The more genomes we recover, the more complicated the picture may become. And honestly, that is exciting, because real history is rarely clean. It has missing pages, contradictions, surprises, unexpected connections. A new skeleton can change an old theory. A new genome can force scientists to rethink a migration. A new burial site can reveal that a population once thought isolated was actually connected to distant communities. Every discovery adds another piece. And the Egyptian puzzle is enormous. We are talking about thousands of years, millions of people, countless families, and an enormous geographic crossroads. If this story is changing the way you see ancient Egypt, imagine what the next 100 ancient genomes could reveal. One genome has opened the door, more could completely redraw the map. If you know someone who thinks ancient history is already solved, send them this video and ask them one simple question. How much of the past is still waiting to be found? Now let's return to that man from Nuweirat. His body was discovered in a ceramic vessel inside a rock-cut tomb. He lived during one of the earliest great chapters of Egyptian civilization. He was an adult male. His bones carried signs of severe osteoarthritis. That means this was not simply a young warrior frozen in time. He had lived long enough for his body to show the wear of years. He had experienced a physical life. We do not know his name. We do not know what he thought. We do not know what he feared. We do not know whether he had children. We do not know whether he ever stood near a pyramid under construction. But we know something extraordinary. A tiny part of him survived. Inside his teeth were fragments of DNA, fragments that had survived heat, time, burial, decay, and thousands of years of history. Scientists extracted those fragments and assembled them into a genome. Imagine that. A person who died before the first great pyramids were completed can now tell us something about his ancestors. Not through a written message, not through a statue, not through a tomb inscription, through chemistry, through the biological code inside his body. And that code tells us that his ancestors were connected deeply to North Africa, while also carrying ancestry connected to the eastern Fertile Crescent. This is not the story of a civilization appearing from nowhere. It is the story of people. And people move. That may sound simple, but it changes everything. Ancient civilizations are often presented as if they appeared fully formed. Egypt had pyramids, Mesopotamia had cities, the Indus Valley had massive settlements, Europe had ancient monuments, but behind every civilization was a long period of movement and change. Before the Pharaohs, there were communities. Before the great temples, there were villages. Before written history, there were countless generations whose names were never recorded. And those forgotten people created the foundation for everything that followed. The Egyptian genome gives us a glimpse into that deeper world. But there is another myth we need to question. The idea that modern populations are simply unchanged versions of ancient populations. This is rarely true. Imagine taking a photograph of a family from 4,500 years ago. Then take another photograph of their descendants today. There might be connections. There might even be strong genetic continuity. But thousands of years of history would still leave their mark. New people arrive. Old populations expand. Some disappear. Some mix. Some become isolated. Disease changes populations. Climate changes where people live. Empires move soldiers. Trade routes attract merchants. Religions bring pilgrims. Wars move refugees. And families carry all of those stories forward. Egypt experienced all of this. The ancient Egyptian population did not simply vanish, nor did it remain perfectly unchanged. Both ideas miss the real story. Instead, Egypt appears to have experienced continuity mixed with repeated interaction and migration. And that is exactly what we should expect from a place sitting at one of the most important crossroads on Earth. The Sahara was not always the same. The climate changed. During wetter periods, parts of North Africa supported more human movement. Later, increasing dryness pushed populations toward places where water was reliable. The Nile became even more important. Over time, communities concentrated around the river. The Nile became the spine of Egyptian civilization. But it was never a wall. It was a road connecting north and south, a road connecting farms and cities, a road connecting Egypt with wider Africa. And Egypt also had another road, the sea. The Mediterranean connected Egypt to distant lands. Ships carried goods, sailors carried stories, merchants carried languages, and people carried genes. This is why the idea of a completely isolated ancient Egypt does not fit the evidence. Egypt was protected by deserts, but it was not sealed off. The desert slowed movement, it did not stop it. And the sea was not a barrier, it was a highway. Over thousands of years, these connections accumulated, one generation at a time, one family at a time, one journey at a time, and eventually those journeys became visible in DNA. Still, there is something even deeper here. DNA does not tell us who someone was in the full human sense. It cannot tell us whether someone was kind. It cannot tell us whether they were brave. It cannot tell us what songs they sang. It cannot tell us who they loved. It cannot tell us what they dreamed about. It only gives us one part of the story. But perhaps that is exactly why DNA is so powerful, because it does not replace history. It adds another voice. Archaeology tells us about objects and places. Written records tell us what people chose to record. Art tells us how people wanted to be seen. Bones tell us about bodies. DNA tells us about biological relationships and ancestry. When these forms of evidence come together, the past becomes clearer, and sometimes they disagree. That is when history becomes especially interesting, because disagreement means we have more to learn. The ancient Egyptian story is one of those cases. For years, people argued about ancestry using modern populations, old measurements, artistic depictions, and limited evidence. Now ancient genomes are giving scientists a new tool, not a final answer, a better tool. And perhaps the biggest lesson is not that ancient Egyptians were secretly one thing or another. The bigger lesson is that they were more connected than simple labels suggest. Their history reaches deep into North Africa. It also reaches toward the eastern Mediterranean and the Fertile Crescent. Later periods brought more interactions. Modern Egyptians carry the results of thousands of years of population movement. That is not a contradiction. That is history. It is also worth remembering that the word Egyptian itself survived through enormous changes. Different rulers controlled Egypt. Different languages influenced the region. Different religions became dominant. Yet the Nile Valley remained a home. People adapted. They changed. They absorbed new influences. And they continued. This is why ancestry and identity should never be treated as exactly the same thing. DNA can tell you about biological ancestors. It cannot tell you what cultural identity means to a person. A population can change genetically while maintaining cultural traditions. And a population can remain genetically connected while its culture changes dramatically. Egypt shows us both processes. The pyramids survived, the temples survived. The language changed, the religions changed, the rulers changed, the people changed. And yet, something about Egypt remained recognizable across thousands of years. That may be the greatest mystery of all. Not that Egypt stayed exactly the same, but that it changed so much and still remained Egypt. Now imagine what is still buried beneath the ground. More tombs, more teeth, more bones, more forgotten communities. Some may contain DNA, some may contain nothing. Ancient DNA is fragile. Most people who lived thousands of years ago will never have their genomes recovered. But every successful sample can be extraordinary. One individual can reveal a migration, several individuals can reveal a population, hundreds can reveal a pattern, and thousands could reveal an entire chapter of human history. That is why the 2025 discovery matters so much. It is not the final answer. It is the beginning of a new chapter. For the first time, researchers have a full genome from an ancient Egyptian who lived around the beginning of the Great Pyramid building age. And that genome does something remarkable. It pushes us away from simple stories. It tells us that early Egypt had deep North African roots. It tells us there was also a meaningful genetic connection with populations farther east. It shows that ancient Egypt was already part of a wider network of human movement. And it reminds us that the modern Egyptian population reflects thousands of years of change. But there's one final question. Why does any of this matter? Why should we care about the DNA of someone who died? It is tempting to take one result and turn it into a giant story of ancient Egypt. Ancient DNA does not work that way. Human genomes we recover, the more complicated the picture may. We have always carried pieces of distant places. And honestly, that is exciting. A person can live in one land rarely clean ancestry from another. It has missing pages, a family contradictions, border, and surprises. Generations later, unexpected connections become part of a completely new skeleton can change an old theory. A journey that seems new genome can force one generation to rethink a migration genetic history of a new burial site population. That is not just ancient history, that is human history. The Egyptian story reminds us that there was never a perfect line separating one people from another. There were rivers, there were deserts, there were mountains, there were languages, there were kingdoms. But people crossed them, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently, sometimes by choice, sometimes because they had no choice. And every journey left traces. Some traces became buildings, some became stories, some disappeared, and some survived inside human DNA. Perhaps that is why the ancient Egyptian genome feels so powerful. It is not simply telling us where one ancient man came from. It is reminding us that civilizations are made by people, and people are never as simple as the labels we give them. The ancient Egyptians were not a single frozen group. They were a population shaped by time. They had deep roots in North Africa. They interacted with the Near East. They lived alongside other African populations. They experienced migration, trade, conquest, marriage, and change. And over thousands of years, all of those forces shaped the people who lived along the Nile. So the real revelation is not that ancient Egyptians were never who we thought. The deeper truth is that we were asking the wrong kind of question. We wanted one identity, one origin, one answer. But ancient DNA is showing us something much more human. There were many origins, many journeys, many families, many stories. And they all met beside the Nile. The pyramids may look permanent. The statues may look eternal. The desert may make history feel frozen. But the people were never frozen. They moved, they changed, they adapted, they mixed, they survived. And now thousands of years later, some of them are speaking again. Not with words, with DNA. A tiny fragment of genetic code can cross almost 5,000 years and reach us. It can travel from an ancient tooth to a modern laboratory, from a forgotten tomb to a computer, from a dead civilization to a living audience. And suddenly, someone whose name has been lost can tell us something that no king's monument could fully explain. He was connected to a world much larger than Egypt. And so were the people around him. Maybe that is the truth we should remember when we look at the pyramids. They were not built by people who lived apart from the world. They were built by people who were part of the world. A world of migration, a world of trade, a world of families, a world of strangers becoming neighbors. A world where distant ancestors could meet beside one river and generations later create one of history's greatest civilizations. And the story is not finished. Far more ancient Egyptians are still waiting beneath the sands. Their DNA may have been destroyed, or it may be quietly surviving inside a tooth, inside a bone, inside a forgotten burial, waiting for technology to become good enough to read it. So perhaps the greatest mystery of ancient Egypt is no longer what the pharaohs wanted us to remember. It is what ordinary people left behind without ever knowing it. Their DNA, their ancestry, their journeys, their connection to a world that was already global, in ways we are only beginning to understand. And maybe one day another genome will be recovered, then another and another. Each one will add another piece to the picture. Some may confirm what we believe today, others may completely surprise us. But that is the beauty of archaeology. The past is not finished. It is still being discovered. And beneath the sand, beneath the tombs, beneath the monuments, the people themselves may still have something to say. We only have to learn how to listen. Because the pyramids told us what ancient Egyptians could build. The temples told us what they believed. The tombs told us how they faced death. But now DNA is beginning to tell us where some of them came from. And that may be the most human discovery of all. Because in the end, ancient Egypt was never just about pharaohs. It was about people. People whose names we forgot. People whose faces turned to dust. People whose lives disappeared into thousands of years of silence. And yet, one tiny piece of them survived. Long enough for us to find it, long enough for science to read it, long enough for the forgotten to speak again. And perhaps that is the real truth DNA has revealed. Not that ancient Egyptians were one thing we never expected, but that they were human beings, shaped by movement, connection, struggle, and time. Just like us. And somewhere in that ancient DNA, hidden for nearly 5,000 years, is a reminder that no civilization exists alone. Every great civilization is built from countless human journeys. Every family carries a history larger than itself. And every person, even one whose name has vanished forever, can leave behind a story that survives longer than stone. The pyramids have stood for thousands of years. But now, something even smaller is helping us see the people who stood beneath them. A fragment of DNA, a trace of a life, a whisper from the ancient world. And the more we listen, the more we may realize that the history of Egypt was never a simple story of one people. It was a story of many people becoming part of one extraordinary civilization. And perhaps the next discovery will not close the mystery. Perhaps it will make the mystery even bigger. Because every answer from the ancient world seems to reveal another question. And that is why, after nearly 5,000 years, the story of ancient Egypt is still not over.